The year was 264 BC, and the Mediterranean world was about to witness something unprecedented. A small city-state on the Italian peninsula, barely 3 centuries old as a republic, was preparing to challenge the greatest maritime power the world had ever known. Carthage commanded the seas with a fleet that had dominated trade routes for generations, yet Rome dared to dream of conquest beyond its borders. What made this audacious ambition possible was not just military prowess or strategic genius, but something far more fundamental. It was the iron will and relentless drive of a handful of aristocratic families who viewed the expansion of Roman power as their personal destiny. These were not ordinary politicians or generals. They were members of dynasties that had shaped the very foundations of the Roman Republic, families whose names would echo through history long after their bloodlines had vanished. The Cornelii, the Fabii, the Aemilii, the Claudii, and dozens of other patrician houses had spent generations building a system of that would allow government them to pursue glory on an unprecedented scale. Each family guarded its reputation with fierce pride, passing down not just wealth and property, but an unshakable belief that they were destined to rule the known world. The story of how Rome conquered the Mediterranean is inseparable from the story of these great houses. Behind every major military campaign, every diplomatic triumph, every expansion of territory, stood members of these ancient bloodlines competing for honour and immortal fame. They were bound together by marriage alliances and torn apart by bitter rivalries that could span generations. Their ambitions would drive Rome to heights of power that seemed impossible, yet their internal conflicts would ultimately tear the Republic apart from within. Understanding these dynasties means understanding the very essence of Roman political culture. This was a world where family name meant everything, where the deeds of one's ancestors determined social standing, and where the pursuit of glory was considered the highest calling. Every young aristocrat grew up hearing tales of his forefathers' exploits, studying the funeral masks of deceased relatives, and dreaming of the day when his own achievements would be added to the family legacy. The pressure to excel was immense, and the competition between rival houses was ruthless. The origins of these great families stretch back to the earliest days of the Republic, when the last king was expelled from Rome in 509 BC. In the chaos that followed, a new system emerged that would define Roman politics for centuries. The patricians, claiming descent from the original settlers of Rome, established themselves as the ruling class. They created the Senate, dominated the consulship, and controlled the religious offices that gave them divine sanction for their authority. Yet this was not a static aristocracy content with privilege alone. These families were driven by an insatiable hunger for achievement that would reshape the ancient world. The Fabii were among the first to demonstrate the kind of ambition that would become characteristic of Roman aristocracy. In the early decades of the Republic, they took it upon themselves to wage private war against the Etruscan city of Veii. This was not an official Roman campaign, but a family enterprise undertaken to enhance their reputation and expand their influence. The entire male line of the Fabii, numbering over 300, marched out to establish a fortress on the Cremera River. Their goal was nothing less than to carve out a private domain that would bring glory to their house for generations. The enterprise ended in catastrophe when the Etruscans wiped out the entire force, leaving only one young Fabius in Rome to continue the family line. Yet even this disaster became part of the family's legend. The sacrifice of the Fabii at Cremera was remembered not as a foolish adventure, but as an example of the courage and dedication that defined true Roman nobility. The surviving branch of the family would go on to produce some of the greatest military commanders in Roman history, including Quintus Fabius Maximus, whose delaying tactics would save Rome during its darkest hour against Hannibal. The Cornelii represented another model of aristocratic excellence, one based on sheer political dominance. This vast family network included multiple branches, each competing to outshine the others in service to the state. The Cornelii Scipiones would become synonymous with military genius, producing the conquerors of Carthage and the architects of Roman expansion into Spain and Africa. The Cornelii Sullae would master the art of political manipulation, wielding the machinery of government with ruthless efficiency. Yet perhaps most impressive of all were the Cornelii, who served as priests and legal experts, shaping the religious and judicial foundations that held the Republic together. What made these families so formidable was not just individual talent, but their ability to function as political machines across generations. Each house maintained networks of clients and allies that extended throughout the Mediterranean world. They arranged marriages to cement alliances, sponsored the careers of promising young men from lesser families, and used their wealth to fund public works that would keep their names before the people. When one member of a great house achieved a significant victory, the entire family benefited from the reflected glory. The competition between these dynasties was intense and sometimes violent. The Claudii and the Fabii engaged in feuds that lasted for decades, using their influence in the Senate to block each other's proposals and undermine their rivals' military commands. The Aemili and the Cornelii competed for dominance in foreign policy, each trying to secure the most prestigious assignments and the greatest opportunities for conquest. These rivalries were not mere personal disputes, but fundamental disagreements about the direction of Roman expansion and the proper role of the aristocracy in governing the growing empire. Yet it was precisely this competitive spirit that drove Rome's remarkable expansion. Each family sought to outdo the achievements of their predecessors and their contemporaries. If the Scipios conquered Carthage, the Aemilius family would conquer Macedonia. If one house celebrated a triumph for victories in Spain, another would seek glory in Gaul or Asia. The result was a relentless drive for conquest that would not be satisfied until Roman eagles flew from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. The system that enabled this expansion was the cursus honorum, the ladder of offices that every ambitious aristocrat was expected to climb. Beginning with junior magistracies in Rome, young nobles would progress through a series of increasingly important positions, each offering greater opportunities for distinction. The praetorship brought command of an army and the chance for military glory. The consulship represented the pinnacle of political achievement, offering the highest military commands and the authority to shape policy for the entire state. But the consulship was only the beginning for the most ambitious families. Former consuls could expect provincial commands that might last for years, governing vast territories and leading massive armies in campaigns of conquest. These proconsular commands were where fortunes were made and reputations established. A successful general could return to Rome with enough wealth to fund spectacular public entertainments, build magnificent temples, and secure the political advancement of his sons and nephews. The wealth that flowed from conquest was staggering. When Lucius Aemilius Paulus defeated Perseus of Macedon in 168 BC, the spoils were so enormous that Roman citizens were exempted from direct taxation for the foreseeable future. The triumph that followed was a spectacle that lasted 3 days, with wagons full of captured weapons, artwork and treasure processing through the streets of Rome, while the defeated king walked in chains behind the victorious general's chariot. Such displays were not mere celebrations, but political statements that enhanced the reputation of the conquering family for generations. The great houses used this wealth strategically, investing in projects that would keep their names before the public. They built temples, aqueducts, and theatres that bore their family names. They sponsored gladiatorial games and theatrical performances that entertained the masses while demonstrating their generosity and public spirit. Most importantly, they used their resources to advance the careers of their relatives and allies, creating networks of obligation that extended throughout the Roman political system. These networks were essential to political success in a system where formal political parties did not exist. Instead, politics was conducted through shifting alliances based on family connections, personal friendships, and mutual obligations. A consul seeking support for a particular policy would need to mobilize not just his own family's resources, but those of allied houses and their extensive networks of clients. The most successful politicians were those who could build the broadest coalitions, often by promising rewards and opportunities to their supporters. The marriages arranged by these families were as much political alliances as personal relationships. A union between a Cornelius and a Caecilius might cement a partnership that would last for decades, with each family supporting the other's candidates for office and military commands. The children of such unions would inherit connections to both family networks, giving them enormous advantages in their own political careers. Conversely, the breakdown of a marriage alliance could have serious political consequences, turning former allies into bitter enemies. Women played crucial roles in maintaining these family networks, though their influence was largely exercised behind the scenes. The great matrons of Rome were expected to manage household affairs, raise children who would bring honour to the family name, and maintain the social connections that were essential to political success. They hosted gatherings where business was conducted, arranged marriages for their children, and provided counsel to their husbands on matters of family strategy. Though they could not hold office themselves, their influence on the men who did was often decisive. The pressure on young aristocrats to live up to their family's reputation was enormous. They grew up surrounded by reminders of ancestral achievement, from the funeral masks displayed in the family atrium to the stories told at dinner parties about great deeds of the past. Every public appearance was an opportunity to demonstrate worthiness of the family name, while every failure risked bringing shame on ancestors and descendants alike. This environment produced individuals of extraordinary ambition and capability, but also created tensions that would eventually tear the Republic apart. The system worked brilliantly as long as there were new territories to conquer and new opportunities for glory. The Mediterranean world offered endless possibilities for ambitious generals and their families. Spain, Gaul, Africa, Greece, and Asia all beckoned with the promise of military commands, vast wealth, and eternal fame. The great houses could channel their competitive energies outwards against foreign enemies while maintaining a rough balance of power among themselves at home. However, this delicate equilibrium began to show signs of strain as the 2nd century BC progressed. The very success of the great families in expanding Roman power created new challenges that would test the foundations of the republican system. As territories grew larger and more distant from Rome, provincial commands became more independent and powerful. Governors could spend years away from the direct oversight of the Senate, building personal armies and accumulating resources that dwarfed anything available to politicians remaining in the capital. The conquest of the Eastern Mediterranean brought Roman aristocrats into contact with the sophisticated political cultures of the Hellenistic kingdoms. Here they encountered forms of absolute monarchy and divine kingship that were alien to Roman tradition. Some members of the great houses began to adopt the mannerisms and ambitions of Eastern potentates, surrounding themselves with Greek philosophers and artists while displaying a magnificence that seemed to mock traditional Roman values of simplicity and restraint. The Scipios were among the first to demonstrate how dangerous this cultural transformation could become. Lucius Cornelius Scipio Asiaticus returned from his campaigns in Asia with such vast wealth that he could afford to build a lifestyle that rivaled that of the defeated kings he had conquered. His brother, the great Scipio Africanus, found himself accused of corruption and misconduct, not because he had actually stolen from the Roman treasury, but because his very success had made him appear to be above the laws that governed ordinary citizens. The trial of the Scipios marked a turning point in the relationship between the great houses and the Roman state. For the first time, a family that had rendered extraordinary service to the Republic found itself under attack from jealous rivals who used the courts as weapons in their political warfare. The spectacle of Rome's greatest heroes being dragged before tribunals and forced to defend their conduct revealed how the competitive spirit that had driven expansion was beginning to turn inward with destructive consequences. The Gracchi brothers represented another facet of this growing crisis. As members of the distinguished Sempronius family, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus had every reason to pursue traditional paths to glory through military commands and provincial governorships. Instead, they chose to champion the cause of the Roman poor, proposing land redistribution and other reforms that threatened the economic foundations of aristocratic power. Their careers demonstrated how the traditional consensus among the great houses was beginning to break down as different families pursued radically different visions of Rome's future. The violent deaths of both Gracchus brothers sent shockwaves through the Roman political establishment. For the first time in the Republic's history, major political disputes had been resolved through bloodshed rather than negotiation and compromise. The sacred principle that Roman citizens could not be executed without trial was violated in the name of preserving order. The great families suddenly realized that their competition for honor and influence could have deadly consequences for themselves and their descendants. Yet rather than moderating their ambitions, many aristocratic houses responded to this crisis by escalating their efforts to achieve dominance. The Metelli emerged as masters of coalition building, using marriage alliances and patronage networks to create a political machine that could control elections and dominate the courts. They understood that in an increasingly violent political environment, survival depended on building overwhelming superiority rather than accepting the sharing of power that had characterized earlier generations. The Caeciliae Metelli demonstrated the sophistication that had developed in aristocratic political strategy by the late 2nd century. Rather than relying solely on military achievement, they invested heavily in legal expertise, oratorical skill, and the cultivation of popular support. They sponsored public works projects, funded religious festivals, and maintained elaborate networks of clients throughout Italy and the provinces. Their success in placing family members in consulships year after year showed how the old system of rotating power among different houses was giving way to more systematic forms of political control. The rise of Gaius Marius represented a fundamental challenge to the dominance of the traditional great houses. Though he eventually married into the prestigious Julius family, Marius came from the small town of Arpinum and lacked the ancestral connections that had been essential to political success. His rise to prominence through military talent alone demonstrated that the old monopoly of the patrician families was breaking down. His recruitment of landless citizens into the legions created a new type of army that was personally loyal to its commander rather than to the state. The Marian reforms transformed the relationship between ambitious aristocrats and military power. Previously, armies had been composed of citizen soldiers who served for limited periods before returning to their farms and businesses. The new professional legions were made up of men who had no economic prospects outside military service and who looked to their commanders for land grants and retirement bonuses. This created opportunities for generals to build personal followings that could be used for political purposes, but it also made the Republic dependent on the loyalty and restraint of individual commanders. The social war that erupted in 91 BC revealed how the expansion of Roman power had created problems that the traditional aristocratic system was ill-equipped to handle. The Italian allies who had fought alongside Roman legions for centuries demanded citizenship rights that would give them a voice in the government that ruled their lives. The great houses were divided on how to respond, with some seeing the allies as potential clients who could strengthen their political positions, while others viewed them as threats to traditional Roman privileges. The career of Lucius Cornelius Sulla showed how far the competitive spirit of the great houses had evolved from its origins in the early Republic. Sulla was a member of an ancient patrician family that had fallen on hard times, lacking the wealth and connections that had traditionally ensured political success. His rise to prominence through military service in Africa and the Social War demonstrated the continuing importance of battlefield achievement, but his methods revealed a new ruthlessness that would have shocked earlier generations. Sulla's march on Rome in 88 BC crossed a line that had never been crossed before in the Republic's history. No Roman general had ever led his legions against the capital city, and the precedent established by this action would haunt the Republic for the remainder of its existence. The great houses suddenly faced the reality that their political competitions could now be settled by military force, transforming the stakes of every dispute and making compromise infinitely more difficult to achieve. The prescription list that Sulla compiled during his dictatorship represented the logical extreme of aristocratic competition. Rather than simply defeating his political enemies, Sulla systematically eliminated entire family lines that had opposed him. The heads of great houses were declared public enemies, their property was confiscated, and their descendants were barred from holding public office. This was not merely political victory, but the complete destruction of rival dynasties that had contributed to Roman greatness for centuries. The survivors of Sulla's purges learned harsh lessons about the new realities of Roman politics. Traditional methods of building influence through marriage alliances and patronage networks were no longer sufficient to ensure survival. Success now required the ability to command military force and the willingness to use it against fellow Romans. The great houses began to adapt their strategies accordingly, seeking provincial commands that would give them access to veteran legions and the resources needed to protect their interests. Pompey the Great emerged from this transformed political landscape as a new type of aristocratic leader. Though he came from a respectable family, the Pompei were not one of the ancient houses that had traditionally dominated Roman politics. Pompey's rise was based purely on military success and his ability to deliver victories that enhanced Roman power and prestige. His extraordinary commands in the East brought him wealth and glory that exceeded anything achieved by previous generations, but they also made him a threat to the established order. The first triumvirate that united Pompey, Caesar and Crassus represented an attempt by the most powerful figures in Rome to divide the spoils of empire among themselves rather than competing for them through traditional political channels. This arrangement acknowledged that the old system of rotating power among different families had broken down completely. Instead of seeking honour through service to the state, the great figures of the late Republic were now treating the state as a prize to be won and exploited. The wealth that flowed from these extraordinary commands was so vast that it distorted the entire Roman economy. Crassus, the richest man in Rome, had accumulated a fortune that allowed him to maintain private armies and buy political influence on a scale that dwarfed the resources of entire provinces. Caesar's conquest of Gaul brought him not only military glory, but also the gold and slaves needed to fund a political organisation that could challenge any rival. Such concentrations of wealth and power made it impossible for lesser families to compete through traditional means. The great houses that had built the Roman Republic found themselves trapped in a system that their own success had made unsustainable. The competitive spirit that had driven centuries of expansion now threatened to destroy the very institutions that had made that expansion possible. Each family faced an impossible choice between accepting subordination to more powerful rivals or risking everything in an attempt to achieve dominance through force. The republic that had been created by aristocratic ambition was being torn apart by those same ambitions carried to their logical extreme. The final generation of the Roman Republic witnessed the emergence of figures whose ambitions transcended anything their ancestors had imagined. These were no longer men content to serve the state and enhance their family's reputation through traditional channels. They were individuals who saw themselves as destined to reshape the very foundations of Roman civilization, and their conflicts would determine whether the Republic would survive or perish. Julius Caesar embodied this transformation more completely than any other figure of his era. Born into an ancient patrician family that traced its origins back to the goddess Venus herself, Caesar possessed all the advantages that centuries of aristocratic tradition could provide. Yet he used these advantages not to preserve the existing order, but to demolish it entirely. His career demonstrated how the competitive spirit of the great houses, when freed from traditional constraints, could produce individuals of such extraordinary ambition that they became threats to the very system that had created them. The Julian family had never been among the most prominent houses of the Republic, though they could claim considerable antiquity and had produced several notable figures in earlier generations. What distinguished Caesar was not his pedigree, but his recognition that the old methods of achieving greatness were no longer sufficient. The traditional cursus honorum, with its careful progression through established offices, was too slow and too limiting for a man who dreamed of accomplishments that would dwarf those of Alexander the Great and the heroes of legend. Caesar's alliance with Pompey and Crassus represented a calculated decision to bypass the normal channels of aristocratic competition. Rather than spending decades building coalitions and waiting for opportunities, he chose to join forces with the two most powerful men in Rome and divide the empire among them like a conquered territory. This arrangement allowed him to secure the Gallic command that would make his reputation, but it also committed him to a path that could only end in supreme power or complete destruction. The conquest of Gaul revealed the full extent of Caesar's genius and ambition. Previous Roman generals had been content to defeat their enemies and return home to celebrate their triumphs. Caesar saw his campaigns as opportunities to create a new type of relationship between a commander and his soldiers. He shared the hardships of his legions, distributed booty generously, and created bonds of personal loyalty that transcended traditional military discipline. His soldiers fought not just for Rome, but for Caesar himself, and they were prepared to follow him anywhere. The wealth that flowed from the Gallic campaigns was deployed with strategic precision to build a political organization that could challenge the established order. Caesar used his resources to fund gladiatorial games and public works projects that kept his name before the Roman people. He cultivated relationships with tribunes and other magistrates who could advance his interests while he was away from the capital. Most importantly, he began attracting to his cause young aristocrats from lesser families who saw in his success a path to advancement that the traditional system had denied them. Marcus Antonius represented one of the most prominent converts to Caesar's cause. Coming from a distinguished plebeian family that had produced several notable orators and generals, Antonius might have been expected to pursue conventional paths to glory. Instead, he became one of Caesar's most trusted lieutenants, recognizing that the old system of aristocratic competition was giving way to something entirely new. His loyalty to Caesar was not based on traditional client-patron relationships, but on a shared vision of personal greatness that transcended republican institutions. The young Marcus Brutus embodied the tragic contradictions of the late Republic's aristocratic culture. As a descendant of the Brutus who had expelled the last king and founded the Republic, he inherited a legacy that demanded unwavering commitment to republican principles. Yet he also lived in an age when those principles were being systematically undermined by the very competitive forces that had made the Republic great. His eventual participation in Caesar's assassination reflected not just personal ambition, but a genuine belief that the old virtues could still be restored through decisive action. The crossing of the Rubicon in 49 BC marked the moment when the competitive spirit of the Roman aristocracy finally destroyed the system that had channeled it for centuries. Caesar's decision to march on Rome with his legions was not a sudden impulse, but the logical culmination of trends that had been building for generations. When traditional political competition became impossible, military force offered the only remaining path to supremacy. The great houses that had once competed for honor within the framework of republican institutions now faced a choice between submission and civil war. The civil war that followed revealed how completely the old consensus had broken down. Families that had been allied for generations found themselves on opposite sides of the conflict. Sons fought against fathers, and brothers took up arms against each other. The Cato family, renowned for their devotion to traditional values, chose suicide rather than submission to Caesar's monarchy. The Pompei, who had risen to greatness through military prowess, found their power broken by a rival who had learned from their example and surpassed their achievements. Caesar's victory at Pharsalus in 48 BC demonstrated the superiority of his new model of aristocratic leadership. His veterans, bound to him by years of shared campaigning and mutual loyalty, proved more effective than traditional Roman armies composed of citizens fulfilling their military obligations. The defeated Pompey, who had once been hailed as the greatest general of his age, fled to Egypt only to be murdered by men who hoped to curry favor with the victor. His death marked the end of the old system of aristocratic competition and the beginning of something entirely unprecedented in Roman history. The dictatorship that Caesar established in Rome was unlike anything the Republic had ever experienced. Previous dictators had been appointed to deal with specific emergencies and had relinquished power as soon as their tasks were completed. Caesar made it clear that his authority would be permanent and that he intended to reshape Roman society according to his own vision. His reforms touched every aspect of Roman life, from the calendar to the citizenship laws, demonstrating that he saw himself not merely as a successful general, but as a new founder of Roman civilization. The great houses that had survived the Civil War found themselves in an impossible position. Those who had supported Caesar were rewarded with offices and honours, but they remained subordinate to his personal authority. Those who had opposed him were either dead or living in exile, their family traditions extinguished forever. Even the survivors faced the reality that their ancient prerogatives had been transferred to a single individual who owed his position not to tradition or election but to military conquest. The conspiracy that ended Caesar's life on the Ides of March 44 BC represented a desperate attempt to restore the old system of aristocratic competition. The conspirators, led by Brutus and Cassius, believed that removing the dictator would somehow allow the Republic to return to its traditional patterns of governance. They failed to understand that the forces which had elevated Caesar were still present, and that his death would only create opportunities for new strongmen to emerge. Marcus Antonius and Gaius Octavius, Caesar's heir, represented two different approaches to filling the vacuum left by the dictator's assassination. Antonius, as Caesar's lieutenant and consul, claimed the right to inherit his political organisation and continue his policies. Octavius, though young and inexperienced, possessed the invaluable advantage of Caesar's name and the loyalty it commanded among the veterans. Their initial alliance against the conspirators soon gave way to competition for supreme power, demonstrating that the cycle of aristocratic rivalry had entered a new and more dangerous phase. The second triumvirate formalized the division of the Roman world among the three most powerful survivors of Caesar's death. Antonius, Octavius, and Lepidus abandoned any pretense of restoring republican government and openly treated the empire as their personal property. Their proscription lists exceeded even Sulla's in their scope and brutality, eliminating not just political enemies but anyone whose wealth could fund their military campaigns. The great orator Cicero, who had spent his career defending republican institutions, became one of the most prominent victims of this systematic elimination of opposition. The Battle of Philippi in 42 BC marked the final defeat of the Republican cause and the triumph of the new aristocratic order based on personal loyalty to individual commanders. Brutus and Cassius, the last champions of the old system, chose death rather than submission to their former peers who had embraced the logic of autocracy. Their defeat demonstrated that military force had completely replaced traditional political competition as the arbiter of power in Roman society. The subsequent division of the Roman world between Antonius and Octavius represented the ultimate evolution of aristocratic rivalry. These were no longer senators competing for consulships or provincial commands, but rulers of vast territories who commanded resources that exceeded those of the greatest kings of antiquity. Their conflict was not about honour or reputation in the traditional sense, but about which of them would become the sole master of the Mediterranean world. Antonius's alliance with Cleopatra of Egypt symbolized how far the Roman aristocracy had moved from its original ideals. The man who had once been Caesar's trusted lieutenant now presented himself as a Hellenistic monarch, surrounded by the luxury and ceremony of Eastern courts. His adoption of foreign customs and his relationship with a foreign queen provided Octavius with powerful propaganda weapons, allowing him to present their conflict as a struggle between Roman tradition and alien corruption. The Battle of Actium in 31 BC brought the long process of aristocratic competition to its inevitable conclusion. Octavius's victory over Antonius and Cleopatra eliminated the last serious rival for supreme power and established a new form of government that would endure for centuries. The young heir of Caesar had learned from the mistakes of his predecessors and understood that lasting power required not just military victory, but the creation of institutions that could channel aristocratic ambitions in ways that supported rather than threatened his authority. The transformation of Octavius into Augustus marked the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of a new era, in which the competitive spirit of the great houses would be directed towards service to the emperor rather than rivalry with each other. The ancient families that had built Rome's empire found themselves transformed into a court aristocracy whose power derived from imperial favour rather than independent achievement. Some adapted successfully to this new reality, while others faded into obscurity or were eliminated by successors who viewed them as threats to the new order. The legacy of the great republican families lived on in the institutions and traditions of the empire, but their role as independent political actors had ended forever. The competitive spirit that had driven Roman expansion for centuries was channeled into new forms of service and achievement, but always within limits defined by imperial authority. The dynasties that had built Rome had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams in expanding Roman power throughout the known world, yet their very success had created forces that made their continued dominance impossible. The story of these families reveals the inherent tensions within any system that attempts to balance individual ambition with collective governance. The Roman Republic had succeeded for centuries in channeling the competitive energies of its aristocracy toward beneficial ends, but the very success of this system created opportunities and temptations that eventually proved irresistible. The great houses that had once competed within established rules found themselves forced to choose between accepting limitations on their ambitions or destroying the framework that had made their greatness possible. The transformation from republic to empire did not occur overnight, nor did it completely extinguish the influence of the great houses that had shaped Roman destiny for centuries. Augustus, the former Octavius, proved to be a master of political theatre, who understood that lasting power required the appearance of continuity, even as fundamental changes were taking place. He carefully preserved many of the traditional offices and ceremonies that had defined republican government, while ensuring that real authority flowed through channels he controlled absolutely. The ancient families found themselves navigating a complex new reality where their survival depended on demonstrating loyalty to the imperial house while maintaining enough dignity to preserve their ancestral prestige. Some, like the Claudii, managed this transition brilliantly by intermarrying with the Julian line and positioning themselves as indispensable partners in governing the empire. The union between Augustus's stepson Tiberius and his daughter Julia created bonds that would eventually place members of the Claudian family on the imperial throne itself. The Aemili Lepidi discovered the dangers of miscalculating in this new environment when Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, the former triumvir, attempted to assert his traditional prerogatives as Pontifex Maximus against Augustus's wishes. His swift removal from political life demonstrated that the old rules of aristocratic competition no longer applied. Families that had once competed as equals now found themselves reduced to the status of courtiers, whose fortunes depended entirely on imperial favour. Yet Augustus was too shrewd to simply crush the traditional aristocracy outright. He recognized that his regime needed the expertise and connections that these ancient houses had accumulated over generations. The Cornelii continued to serve as governors and military commanders, though now their authority derived from imperial appointment rather than senatorial election. The Fabii found new roles as administrators and legal experts, applying their accumulated wisdom to the challenges of governing a vast empire under centralized control. The imperial court that developed around Augustus created new forms of competition that replaced the old political rivalries. Families now competed for access to the emperor, for advantageous marriages with imperial relatives, and for the prestigious appointments that could enhance their status within the new hierarchy. The skills that had once been used to build coalitions in the Senate were now deployed in navigating the complex etiquette and factional politics of palace life. The Julio-Claudian dynasty that ruled for the first century of the empire represented a fascinating fusion of old and new elements in Roman aristocratic culture. Augustus had been careful to adopt promising young men from established families, creating a pool of potential heirs who combined imperial legitimacy with traditional aristocratic credentials. His adoption of Tiberius Claudius Nero brought one of Rome's most ancient houses into the imperial family, while his marriage alliances connected him to other prominent lineages throughout the aristocratic establishment. Tiberius, who succeeded Augustus as emperor, embodied both the possibilities and the problems of this new system. As a member of the ancient Claudian house, he possessed all the traditional qualifications for leadership that Romans expected from their rulers. His military record was exemplary, his knowledge of law and precedent was extensive, and his connections throughout the aristocratic establishment were unparalleled. Yet his reign was marked by growing tensions between the imperial court and the traditional senatorial families who resented their reduced status. The reign of Caligula revealed how completely the old system of aristocratic restraints had broken down. This young emperor, whose full name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, combined the worst aspects of unlimited power with the competitive instincts that had once driven his ancestors to greatness. His persecution of prominent senators and his demands for divine honours demonstrated that imperial authority, when wielded without wisdom or restraint, could become a force for destruction rather than order. Claudius, who followed his nephew Caligula to the throne, represented a return to the scholarly traditions that had always been part of Roman aristocratic culture. His extensive writings on Etruscan history and his efforts to reform the legal system showed how the intellectual pursuits that had once been secondary to political and military careers could flourish under imperial patronage. Yet even his reign was marked by palace intrigues and power struggles that reflected the continuing influence of aristocratic family networks. The Flavian dynasty that emerged after the Civil War of 69 AD demonstrated how new families could rise to imperial power by mastering the changed dynamics of Roman politics. Vespasian came from a relatively modest Italian family that had gained prominence through military service and administrative competence rather than ancient lineage. His success showed that the empire had created opportunities for advancement that transcended the old patterns of aristocratic dominance, though his sons Titus and Domitian struggled with many of the same challenges that had plagued their more illustrious predecessors. The adoptive system that reached its peak under the Antonine emperors represented perhaps the most successful solution to the problem of combining imperial authority with aristocratic traditions. Rather than relying solely on hereditary succession, emperors like Trajan and Hadrian chose their heirs based on merit and capability, often selecting promising individuals from established senatorial families. This approach allowed the empire to benefit from the accumulated wisdom and connections of the traditional aristocracy, while ensuring that power passed to competent hands. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor who ruled during the height of imperial prosperity, embodied the transformation of aristocratic ideals under the new system. His meditations revealed a mind shaped by centuries of Roman moral philosophy, yet adapted to the realities of absolute power. His reflections on duty, honour and service showed how the competitive spirit of the old aristocracy had been channeled into a new form of excellence based on personal virtue rather than public achievement. The crisis of the 3rd century demonstrated the fragility of the system that had seemed so stable during the Antonine Golden Age. As barbarian invasions and internal rebellions multiplied, the empire found itself dependent on military commanders who often came from provincial backgrounds rather than the traditional Roman aristocracy. The old families that had once dominated the Senate found themselves marginalized by a new class of soldier emperors who valued battlefield effectiveness over aristocratic credentials. Yet even during this period of apparent decline, the influence of the great houses persisted in modified forms. The senatorial order continued to provide administrators, legal experts, and cultural leaders who helped maintain the continuity of Roman civilization. Their estates became centres of learning and artistic patronage that preserved classical traditions, even as political power shifted to new hands. The networks of marriage and clientage that they had developed over centuries continued to shape social relationships throughout the Mediterranean world. The conversion of Constantine to Christianity created new challenges and opportunities for the surviving aristocratic families. Some, like the Anisi, successfully adapted to the changed religious landscape and became prominent patrons of the early church. Others found themselves caught between their ancestral traditions and the demands of the new faith, struggling to reconcile classical learning with Christian doctrine. The emergence of Christian aristocrats like Jerome and Augustine showed how the competitive spirit of the old houses could be redirected toward theological and literary pursuits. The division of the empire into eastern and western halves created parallel aristocratic establishments that gradually diverged in character and function. The senatorial families of Rome continued to play important roles in the governance of Italy and the western provinces, while their counterparts in Constantinople developed new forms of court culture that blended Roman traditions with Greek learning and Christian theology. Both groups remained conscious of their connections to the great houses of the Republican era. even as their actual power and influence continued to diminish. The barbarian invasions of the 5th century forced the remaining aristocratic families to confront the ultimate consequences of the changes that had been building for centuries. Some, like the Simaci, attempted to preserve classical culture and traditional values in the face of Germanic conquest. Others, like certain branches of the Anisi, adapted by forming alliances with barbarian rulers and helping to create the foundations of medieval European society. The flexibility and resilience that had once enabled these families to dominate republican politics now helped them survive the collapse of the Western Empire itself. The legacy of the great republican families extended far beyond their political achievements to encompass their contributions to law, literature, philosophy, and the arts. The legal principles developed by jurists from houses like the Musi continued to influence European law for centuries after the fall of Rome. The historical works of aristocratic authors preserved a knowledge of republican institutions and values that would inspire later generations of political thinkers. Even their architectural monuments and artistic patronage created models of excellence that shaped Western civilization for millennia. The competitive spirit that had driven these families to build an empire ultimately transcended the political system that had given it birth. Medieval nobles who claimed descent from Roman senators, Renaissance humanists who studied classical texts, and modern republicans who sought to revive ancient virtues all drew inspiration from the example of the great houses. The idea that aristocratic families had a special responsibility to serve the common good, even at great personal cost, became a persistent theme in Western political thought. The rise and fall of these dynasties revealed fundamental truths about the relationship between individual ambition and collective achievement that remain relevant to any society that seeks to balance excellence with stability. The Roman Republic succeeded for centuries in channeling the competitive energies of its elite families toward beneficial ends, creating a system that rewarded merit while maintaining social cohesion. Yet the very success of this system created forces that eventually proved impossible to control. The transformation of republican competition into imperial service represented both a loss and a gain for Roman civilization. The spontaneous creativity and bold innovation that had characterized the great age of expansion gave way to more systematic and controlled forms of excellence. The empire that emerged from the ruins of the Republic was more stable and administratively efficient than its predecessor, but it lacked the dynamic energy that had made Rome master of the Mediterranean world. The story of these families also illuminated the crucial role that women played in maintaining aristocratic power and influence across generations. Though they could not hold office or command armies, the great matrons of Rome were instrumental in arranging the marriages, managing the estates, and preserving the cultural traditions that kept their houses prominent. Their salons became centers of intellectual life, their correspondence networks facilitated political alliances, and their patronage supported the artists and writers who celebrated family achievements. The educational system that these families developed to prepare their children for leadership created lasting contributions to human knowledge and culture. The emphasis on rhetoric, philosophy, and historical study that characterized aristocratic education produced generations of individuals who could think clearly, speak persuasively, and act decisively in complex situations. The synthesis of Greek learning and Roman practical wisdom that emerged from these educational traditions influenced intellectual development throughout the ancient world and beyond. The religious practices maintained by the great houses reflected their understanding of the relationship between human achievement and divine favour. Their careful attention to auguries, their elaborate funeral ceremonies, and their magnificent temple dedications demonstrated a belief that aristocratic excellence required supernatural sanction. The transition to Christianity represented not just a change in religious belief, but a fundamental reorientation of aristocratic values toward different forms of service and different definitions of success. The economic foundations of aristocratic power underwent constant evolution as the empire expanded and changed. The vast estates that supported senatorial families became models of agricultural organization and technological innovation. Their urban properties served as centers of commerce and manufacturing that connected local economies to Mediterranean-wide trading networks. The wealth they accumulated from conquest and administration was reinvested in ways that promoted economic development throughout the Roman world. The military traditions of these families evolved in response to changing strategic requirements and technological developments. The citizen soldiers of the early republic gave way to professional armies that required different forms of leadership and organization. Aristocratic commanders had to master not only traditional tactics and strategy, but also the complex logistics of supplying armies across vast distances and the delicate diplomacy required to manage relationships with allied and subject peoples. The cultural patronage provided by the great houses created an environment in which artistic and literary achievement could flourish on an unprecedented scale. Their libraries preserved and transmitted the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world, while their commissions provided employment for artists, architects, and writers who created works of lasting beauty and significance. The competitive desire to outdo rival families in magnificence and taste drove innovations in architecture, sculpture, and decorative arts that influenced aesthetic development for centuries. The international connections developed by these families through conquest, diplomacy, and trade created networks of communication and exchange that facilitated the spread of ideas, technologies, and cultural practices throughout the ancient world. Their marriages linked Roman aristocrats to ruling families in Greece, Asia Minor, and other regions, creating bonds that outlasted political changes and military conflicts. Their clients and allies in distant provinces served as intermediaries between Roman and local cultures, facilitating the process of cultural synthesis that characterized the imperial age. The legal and administrative innovations pioneered by aristocratic statesmen created institutional frameworks that proved remarkably durable and adaptable. The constitutional principles they developed to balance competing interests and prevent the concentration of power in any single individual or faction influenced political thought long after the Republic had disappeared. Their legal codes and judicial procedures provided models for later civilizations seeking to create systems of justice that could function across diverse populations and territories. The decline of these ancient houses was not merely a political phenomenon, but a cultural transformation that reshaped the very foundations of Roman identity. As the traditional aristocracy found their influence diminishing under the imperial system, new forms of excellence emerged that would define the character of late antiquity. The scholarly pursuits that had once been secondary to military and political careers became primary sources of distinction for families seeking to maintain their relevance in a changing world. The Symachi exemplified this transformation through their dedication to preserving classical learning and literary culture. Rather than competing for military commands or provincial governorships, successive generations of this distinguished house devoted themselves to philosophical inquiry, historical scholarship, and the patronage of poets and artists. Their correspondence networks connected intellectuals throughout the Mediterranean world, creating communities of learning that transcended political boundaries and religious differences. The emergence of Christian aristocrats created new dynamics within the traditional hierarchy of Roman society. Families like the Anizi discovered that conversion to the new faith opened unprecedented opportunities for influence and service. Their wealth and organizational skills, previously directed toward political advancement, could now be channeled into building churches, supporting monasteries, and funding charitable works that enhanced both their spiritual standing and their social prestige. The barbarian settlements within Roman territories presented both challenges and opportunities for the established aristocracy. Some families viewed the Germanic newcomers as threats to their ancestral privileges and cultural traditions. Others recognized that accommodation and alliance offered the best hope for preserving their influence in a rapidly changing world. The marriages between Roman aristocrats and barbarian nobles that became increasingly common during the 4th and 5th centuries created new hybrid cultures that blended classical and Germanic traditions. The administrative system that developed during the later empire required new forms of expertise that played to the traditional strengths of the great houses. Their accumulated knowledge of law, precedent, and local conditions made them invaluable partners in governing the vast territories that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. Provincial governors drawn from senatorial families brought both practical experience and cultural sophistication to the complex task of maintaining order and prosperity across diverse populations. The great families who built the Roman Republic achieved something unprecedented in human history. Through their relentless competition and boundless ambition, they transformed a small Italian city-state into the master of the Mediterranean world. Yet their very success contained the seeds of their own destruction, as the forces they unleashed ultimately consumed the system that had made their greatness possible. Their legacy lives on in the institutions, laws, and cultural achievements that continue to shape our world today.